So what was the effect on policy to have these independents running around?
Well, I think the leadership had to take into account where was the Democratic Study Group, as we call it. I was head of that at one time. What were the independent Democrats thinking? And they were a faction that was quite important, especially in the Democratic side, and they had to be accounted for. Today, the factions that are most important are ethnic or minority group factions. In Illinois, of course, the Hispanic and the so-called Black Caucus, they may call it African American Caucus, but I was going to call it Black Caucus, became more important than the old Reformed or Democratic Study Group Caucus, which was multiracial. We had black independents as well as whites. So it's kind of led to a breakup of the importance of the independent, so-called liberal, or whatever you want to call it, Democrats, and more onto caucuses of ethnic groups. You would have of course, women's caucus, but also even an ethnic, what they call an ethnic caucus, of those more conservative Democrats that came from white ethnic backgrounds that felt they were being left out, so they have a caucus. But I don't think there's any more Democratic Study Group or independent or liberal caucus within the Democratic Party, because that consisted primarily of independents elected through cumulative voting. Some people may think that's a good idea to get rid of that that group, and but if they think that way, they've succeeded.
Was there a similar situation on the Republican side?
Republicans had a group, I think, of Chicago Republicans who tended to be more urbanized, more favorable to helping the Chicago public schools, more favorable to urban and city problems, because they were Republican representatives, including black Republicans, which aren't anymore, from the city. And that's one thing where Joseph Medill was farsighted. There were black Republicans from Chicago because they could be elected through cumulative voting to the legislature, and some of them, a few of them might have been lackeys of the Democrats, but in more recent years, as black political awareness became stronger, they became real, genuine liberal Republican blacks, and they were kind of a good thing to have within the Republican Party. Now the Republican Party in Illinois, and its leadership, in its convention delegations, in its legislative delegation, is virtually an all-white party.
So why is it important to have black Republicans?
Well, if you believe our party system, which I do, shouldn't be 100% ideological one way or another. They haven't been so much in recent years. If you believe in the kind of the big tent theory, which I do, having conservative, moderate, and maybe even some liberal Republicans, and the same way with the Democrats, which the Democrats seem to have now. I think that's good for the two-party system. If you believe in kind of the old British or French system of a strong labor left party and a strong business right party, then probably the elimination of cumulative voting satisfied you. I kind of feel the parties in America, since we're so institutionalized with two parties, should have representation from different groups within a party. Otherwise, we get more and more divisive, the parties, and with no common ground. There are signs of that happening from time to time.
You talked a bit about what the relationship between campaign financing and cumulative voting is. Could you elaborate a bit on that, and how maybe people who are concerned about campaign finance reform might consider cumulative voting?
With cumulative voting, less money was spent in elections because you knew you'd get two of the majority party using one of the minority party. There were some swing districts, and they decided which way the legislature went. But of the 59 districts, maybe only a dozen real swing districts. The others were either dominated by one party or the other, so less money was spent. and the individual candidates were more capable of raising the money needed. Now, with the head-on-head, in all the close districts, they even use television for House races, which was never used in the past, like in Rockford, or where there's television, or in Decatur, or in Peoria, or Springfield, where you have local television stations. Even though that television is not nearly as expensive as Chicago, it's still expensive compared to what was spent in the past, and more spending going on at these races, and this money has to come from the top. They can't raise that kind of money in Southern Illinois, so the Democrats have to go to the trial lawyers or their big benefactors, and the Republicans have to go to the medical society or the chamber or manufacturers groups, chamber of commerce groups, and other big business groups in order to get the money to the top, and then the leaders funnel it down to the members. I guess that's been going on in Britain in the parliamentary system for years, but it's led to a certain lack of independence by the members. In the English Parliament, if that's the way we want it, when the whips are out, that it's a party vote, if you don't vote with the party, you're knocked off the ticket the next time. You're not put up, because it all comes centrally, and that's beginning to come now. Candidates are being named in local districts by the leadership. They say that candidate is unacceptable by us, and this candidate is acceptable, and the power they have is the power of the money, of the campaign contributions, which they get from the big Democrats, from the trial lawyers, from labor, Republicans, from business organizations, and the medical society. And they can dictate now from the top who the Democrat or who the Republican candidate will be in these close elections, where in the past it was kind of a free-for-all primary determined who was nominated. And so there's more and more control, and money in politics, unfortunately, exercises a lot of control. The only way to get around that is with multimillionaire candidates, and they're not attracted to legislative races the way they are to U.S. Senate races and even congressional races in California and other states. You look in California, almost every major candidate is a multimillionaire in their own right, because they're unlimited in the amount they can spend on their own campaign, or they're married to a multimillionaire.
So how would you describe yourself politically?
Well, like a lot of people, I tend to be more moderate today maybe than I was years ago, but I was hard to pin down. I think on social issues, I would have been called a liberal when one was willing to call themselves that, and not as a pejorative term, but and on economic issues, I'm more of a moderate. I'd say a mainstream Democrat, but not a machine Democrat.
A bit off the topic, could you tell us about your recollections of living in Cambridge when Plan E was instituted?
Well, I just started there. As I recall, that year there was a congressional opening in Cambridge where Mayor Curley had gone to prison. He was congressman and mayor at the same time. And the mayor of Cambridge was running, and he was opposed by a young veteran who had just come out of service, who was quite well-to-do, John F. Kennedy, who had didn't live quite in the district, but who won the primary and went on from there to glory, as you know, senator, and then other things. But there was a Plan E had just been adopted, I guess, by the state as one of the alternatives. I suppose A, B, C, D, and E alternatives that a municipality could adopt. Almost everyone in Massachusetts lives in a municipality, very little unincorporated area. And in Cambridge, being had this Cambridge Civic Association, which was a group of independents, and they liked Plan E. First Plan E was nonpartisan in its nature. It assured some minority representation by being proportional, and people were low and people were limited, and you know how it works. And Plan E was considered a great modern step, and it's worked in Cambridge. It's been there ever since. There's been groups who wanted to get rid of it, but they never were able to, even though the Cambridge Civic Association, or CCA, has lost out in recent years. Those who have won, I don't think have even advocated eliminating Plan E. So Plan E did take Cambridge politics away from the old politicians, most of whom in the Boston area were Irish, and more recent years Italian as well, but and put it in the hands of the typical voter, and led to a lot of independence coming forward in that community. And I think considered pretty good government. They combine that with a managerial form of government. And it's a city of over 100,000. People think Cambridge is just a university community of Harvard, MIT, Radcliffe, and so on. Cambridge has a big blue-collar population. Lever Brothers had a big soap factory there. There are all kinds of plants close to the MIT side of Cambridge. Smokestack plants originally. There were poor people, there were minority people. Cambridge is more diverse than you think, and the university communities were not as heavy voters because the students, of course, would only register maybe for a presidential election and then sometimes at home. And the faculty was concerned, and they did vote, and cumulative voting came in then and was considered to be reform that was going to sweep the country. Well, it did sweep some Massachusetts cities at the time. New York City still had a form of proportional PR, proportional representation. PR was considered a great reform, the way cumulative voting was in 1870. And few places it remains, and others it doesn't. But in Cambridge, it caught on and has remained. But it was considered a real reform post-World War II. Veterans, everyone liked it. It took politics away from the ward politician and gave it to the people.
Do you agree with that?
I would say the one danger is if you make proportion. So if you have such a big group like Israeli Parliament, which had 100 members, Knesset, so that someone getting 1% of the vote at one time could be elected to the Knesset over 1%. I think they've modified that. In modified form, I think it works. You want minority representation, but maybe not from 5% of the population. Maybe if a group would represent 25% of the population, I think it's very good. If you get fringe groups, certain countries I think require you to get 5% of the vote to be represented in the parliament. I don't know if Germany requires that, something because they're trying to eliminate neo-Nazis and so on in fringe groups. So with that in mind, with that caveat in mind, I would favor it, yeah.
Did Illinois ever elect fringe groups?
Illinois has been a two-party state. These groups you read about, even the radical right or Christian coalition, and on the left, the far left, doesn't seem to get a real foothold in Illinois because the party structure is stronger, and we don't have initiative and referendum the way California does. So we don't get things except the elimination of cumulative voting through referendum. We get them through the legislative body, and the legislative body is still pretty much controlled by the two parties. There's no independents elected. Even the U.S. Congress has Bernie Sanders from Vermont elected as an independent, but basically two-party. So Illinois has never been a fringe. Fringe groups have never really gotten a hold in Illinois.
Do you think it's possible to revive cumulative voting in Illinois politically?
It would take something kind of scandal that would draw the reformers' attention to the need for it. One would be campaign contribution scandals, which are just waiting to come out. The legislature today, and I do some legislative representation as part of my law practice. The legislature today accesses all contributions, and not only unsavory groups, but the most legitimate groups have to make contributions. So where does that leave people that can't make contributions, like social welfare agencies, people, even municipalities? I was mayor of Highland Park for 8 years. Municipalities can't make political contributions. The Illinois Municipal League can't make political contributions. So we have to rely on what little power we have over our electorate, or little strength we have from our electorate in our district. But we can't compete with other groups that are trying to impose things on municipalities, whether it be groups of trial lawyers that want to be able to sue municipalities. We just can't compete, and that's true of religious groups. It's true of education reform groups, except for the unions themselves. But the school boards can't make political contributions. And so there's going to be a scandal. I think there's going to be a big scandal in Illinois, political contributions. I read the Even the newspapers this morning in Chicago and throughout the state are pointing out the driver's licenses, truck driver's licenses may have been sold by workers at the Secretary of State's office so they could raise money for the political campaign of the incumbent Secretary of State, although he personally didn't know this was being done. But that's the kind of thing it will continue and will get worse, and I think could lead to reform. But people are pretty apathetic until there's a real scandal, and there will be. Our whole political campaign, political contribution system in this country is a scandal. Yeah. It's limiting the U.S. Senate to very wealthy candidates or spouses of wealthy candidates. It's coming down to the congressional level, where you can spend $1 million in congressional race. There are state senate and state rep contests now where people are spending $300,000 and $400,000, and they're wealthy people don't even want to run at that level particularly. So it's all dominated by the big contributor groups, and we know what those are. That's revealed. I guess the biggest are the lawyers, the doctors, insurance, banks, and whatever has a special interest going in Springfield.
Do you think then those special interests get their way in terms of policy?
They seem to, yeah. They seem to have a lot more influence. At least they have to reveal their contributions now. Now, if you read books about the turn of the century and before and after, there was certainly some boondoggling going on with legislators in all 50 states, or for 48, whatever there was then, and with graft and corruption. But in recent years, that had been reduced, but now it's pinstripe type influence. It's still money. It's money, and the big battles are the ones where money is represented. Sometimes it leads to no legislation. There's been cases where in the telecommunications industry, where I have to do some work for MCI, where the long-distance companies, AT&T, MCI, and Sprint are for a bill, and the local exchange companies, Ameritech, GTE, are against it. And therefore, it's kind of neutralized because they've got contributors on both sides, and they kind of checkmate each other. So maybe there should be legislation, but there isn't, because they don't want to even get into it between these two groups that are good contributors. They want to avoid those kind of confrontations, so they tend to avoid that issue, so they don't get in the confrontation between the two groups, unless they just want to play them off for a while. But there's definitely too much influence from campaign contributions. I'm sure any political scientist feels that way, and most candidates feel that way. And Paul Simon is working on that right now in Southern Illinois and Carbondale. There's going to be a scandal, and I think when that scandal occurs, which could be tomorrow, then cumulative voting should be put forward as a way of reducing all the money that's being spent on these campaigns by tending to more localize the contests.
One question, I think this is our last one. One question we have in the cumulative voting reform group is the thought whether or not we could politically go back to the big house of 177, or whether we'd be constrained to the current size, and then we'd have to have larger districts.
Well, or you go somewhere in between. Go ahead.
Okay. So do you think it's possible to go back to the big house of 177, or are we constrained to have larger districts of 117?
It would be possible to go to the big house of 177. Some might argue that that would cost more money. Actually, our costs have not gone down in the legislature since we reduced the size. We wouldn't be the largest, but there is a legitimate trend towards making the houses a little smaller. I know Texas may be larger than we are, Pennsylvania, but California has made it smaller. So we could go somewhere in between the 118, 177, or look for cumulative voting of the 118. It might be easier to sell the campaign if it doesn't result in enlarging the House back to the 177 members. And one way is a good year is a reapportionment year coming up, because with population decreases in certain areas, increases in others, areas that are decreasing in population would support a larger Senate or a larger House, like Southern Illinois, maybe inner city of Chicago, where they're losing representation, one way of preserving it is to enlarge the body and make less population per district requirements. So I think there's not opposition per se to a larger House or Senate. It's just that most people feel it's uneconomic, or these bodies are big enough. And you might want to, if we want to really push cumulative voting, not enlarge the House back to the 177. But the 118 has not saved any money. They've just pushed the salaries up and gotten full-time legislators without much knowledge of what a citizen does or how a citizen earns a living. We don't have the citizen legislators anymore. Congress has happened too. We have professional legislators.
So this is the time when we give our interviewees their chance to say whatever they want, if there's anything left to say.
All right. I think cumulative voting worked in Illinois. There's some nostalgia because we did have outstanding people at the time. I don't have to go all through the names. I mentioned Abner Mikva, Tony Scariano. We had Adlai Stevenson III, who became U.S. Senator. We had George Burdett and other outstanding Republicans over the years. But without naming all the people who came with cumulative voting, we had a better legislator as far as diversity goes, as far as independence and prominence in the society as a whole, and not just in politics. And the evils that cumulative voting had supposedly had, one-party domination of the other party in certain districts, was really decreasing and almost eliminated by the time we came to cumulative voting. There were probably only 2 or 3 districts on the west side of Chicago that still had Democratic domination of the Republican Party. The Republicans now have the governorship, so they can create enough patronage and strength in these areas. So the evil of cumulative voting, supposed evil, was disappearing. There were Democrats in suburbs, Democrats downstate, Republicans in more and more in Democratic areas. I think that cumulative voting was an experiment that worked. It wasn't a failure. Just because other states chose to not to adopt it, it worked in Illinois. And our current system has the same evils that the U.S. Congress does, and that is the evil of domination from fundraising at the top, bringing in the president, going to all these districts to raise for Senate candidates and so on. At the local level, the legislative level is the same thing. A dozen large trade associations, professional associations, dominate who's nominated by parties, and often the vote in the legislature. And believe me, it's as bad a scandal or a worse scandal than anything that occurred under cumulative voting.
Excellent. Right. A great interview. Right. So if you could tell us your name and the title you'd like underneath your
name, rank, and serial number.
Right.
Barbara Flynn Curry, State Representative, 25th District, House Majority Leader.
And if we did a voiceover, like a 20-second biography, what would that sound like?
Ooh, it would say that Barbara is a progressive Democrat representing a Mid-South Side district from the city of Chicago. She's been a strong champion of civil rights and liberties, a strong feminist, and someone who's very concerned about the provision of basic services, education, welfare, medical care to vulnerable populations, to people in need.
Okay, 2 quick things. One is whenever he doesn't exist, so we will make eye contact the entire time.
You mean I can't look at the camera?
No.
Does it, you know, but, okay, all right.
So what are some of the numbers and figures of the years you got?
I was elected first in 1978, and we had cumulative voting until the 1982 election. So starting in 1983, we went to single-member districts. So I was in the House from 79, 80, 81, and 82 under multi-member districts, cumulative votes.
Could you tell us about your first campaign in 1978 and the role cumulative voting might have played in it?
I think it was very important. In fact, I was a political footnote in Illinois history, one that will not be repeated. Carol Moseley Braun and I were the first and last time that a district, a House district in the state of Illinois, sent 2 women from the same political party to represent the district in the Illinois House of Representatives. That year, a longtime progressive independent incumbent decided late in the game not to stand for re-election. I believe 10 altogether of us put our hats in the ring in the Democratic primary. Neither Carol nor I was supported by the regular Democratic organization, AKA the machine. I think about half the candidates had some machine ties and half did not. And at the end of the day, Carol and I ended up the two nominees. Another incumbent who had not chosen to give up his seat in the House was in fact defeated for renomination in that primary in 1978. Cumulative voting was very important in that people had the opportunity to, of course, choose two for two slots, but they also had the opportunity to put all of their eggs into a particular basket. And it's my view that given that Carol and I shared support from some of the same geographical parts of the district, not entirely, but to some extent, it was probably helpful to both of us that the cumulative vote was available.
That's a wonderful way to phrase that, by the way. Your eggs in one basket.
I will be running out of battery at some point. I just want to let you know, but it hasn't happened yet, so don't worry about it.
How did what were some of the what was it like in the House with cumulative voting?
Well, it was somewhat. Remember, there were two issues that are a little hard to separate, and one is that the House was much larger in the days when we had the cumulative vote. So there were 177 members of the House. I'm sorry, 107.
That's right.
177 members of the House instead of 118. And that number itself has certain consequences for the behavior of the body, for the ease with which the body is controlled, for all kinds of things. But I would say that one of the differences in the days of cumulative vote was that there was much more cooperation across partisan lines. There was also, I think, a greater, not always, but some greater degree of civility. I would certainly say the House was totally unruly in those days. It is perhaps still somewhat unruly, but perhaps on the whole and on the average a little less so. That is, chaos was more tippish in the days when we had cumulative votes in multi-member districts.
I know it's probably difficult to do, but could you ascribe that to either the size of the House more than cumulative voting or vice versa?
The chaos, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
I guess I would say that probably had more to do with numbers. 177 people are louder, their voices echo more strongly, whatever they're doing exacerbates the feeling tone that a hustle and a bustle is upon us. So I think that had more to do with the number rather than the system of representation.
What types of people were elected using cumulative voting that were not elected in single member?
I think what you had with cumulative voting was representation from the more extreme parts of political parties in every district, and that had both good and bad consequences. You also had, I think, the election of people who were particularly unlikely to fare well in a single member district by virtue of the ethnicity they brought to the ticket or their failure to capture the mechanisms of the majority party. So you had many more opportunities for minority members of even the dominant party to win election than we have seen since. And that brought with it a fair degree of imagination, certainly a fair number of people who were off the wall, a little wacko, but it seemed to me that the price of the wacko was a price I was willing to pay, because you got people who were particularly thoughtful, people who were particularly imaginative, people who were better able to represent minority citizens within their districts than those people in any other circumstance would find themselves able to avail representation.
Why was that important for the Illinois House?
I think it was important because it did bring more imagination to the whole body. It brought a kind of debate that seems to me to have been much more complete. The kinds of viewpoints that were represented and were brought to the debate tended to be much more various, much more different, much broader in scope than happens today. Single-member districts, I believe, press the middle, encourage, not a bad thing in government, encourage compromise and consensus, but they may also keep people from debating to that point of consensus from the perspectives that are as varied, as wide, as broad-ranging as we had in the days of cumulative votes.
Do you want to pause?
No, I don't think. Oh, for her to do that?
Right, right.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess what I'm suggesting is that with the pressure on legislators to represent the most mainstream part of a district, the debate almost happens before you get to the House floor or to the committee discussion. People bring what they perceive to be the majority view of their district. In the days of multi-member districts and cumulative votes, you had people who recognized that they did represent a distinct minority perspective, or that perspective needed to be included because perhaps they were not as fearful of the electorate for whatever reason, that they were able to bring a different perspective to the discussions themselves. The current system, which has definitely some advantages, encourages the legislator to take the easy way out or respond to what they perceive to be the majority opinion without going through the discussion that a Burke, for example, would have suggested that legislators, or Madison, whomever, refining and enlarging the public opinion.
Which system do you think produced a more accurate reflection of the true mainstream consensus view of Illinois policy?
Hard to be sure. In some ways, the cumulative vote multi-member district system succeeded in doing that because represented in the assembly were people who championed minority, distinct, different viewpoints regionally or from any other perspective. On the other hand, what you have now is a sense on the part of lawmakers that it is better, safer, more sensible for them to be where they believe the majority opinion in their own districts already finds itself. So one could argue that if you take the majority opinion from 118 different districts, each of which is adequately, whether or not that's, that's obviously a evidentiary question, but assume that each legislator does represent the majority view on issue X of his or her constituents, and you could argue that the 118 different majorities or whatever working together do come out to a vote that reflects what is the real majority. The other system might have given greater weight from issue to issue to different kinds of minority voices.
Do you think one system was more small d democratic than the other?
Oh, I think definitely the cumulative vote multi-member district system was that, because what it did was to give the opportunity for minority party and minority political representation in each district to have a shot at a seat in Springfield. So in that sense, I think the small d edge definitely goes with the cumulative vote.
I'm going to ask you that again and ask you to include the word democratic in your
Okay,
answer.
okay.
Hey, we're not repeating the question.
Yes, okay, all right.
Forget that you're good in conversation, which is great, really, but
Right, okay,
it's hard on
all
my
right.
sound bites.
Yeah,
Long
but
sound
I don't
bites.
have to repeat the whole thing, do I?
No, we just say that.
Yeah.
Just that I'm talking about small d as in democratic small d as opposed to big D democratic representation.
Wonderful. Could we talk about some of the drawbacks of the cumulative?
Sure. Sure. One of the drawbacks was that in some districts there was not a sufficiently organized minority to adequately use the opportunity for representation. So that, for example, in some of the City of Chicago districts, the second party representative, the Republican, as it were, was actually someone appointed by the regular Democratic organization. Similarly, in some of the Republican, very strongly Republican districts, the person who seemed to be the Democrat was perhaps closer to Republican seatmates than to whoever might have been joining that individual on the Republican ticket. That was a distinct disadvantage. So there were some people who sort of were there, they were kind of stand-ins for the party. If the party was not well organized at the local level, then it may well be the few people who were organized who were able to identify a Republican member to serve in a majority Democratic district. Conversely, the Democratic chieftains may have been able to select a Republican stand-in in the heavily Democratic areas. So you did not get for all I've said, that the advantage is that you get minority party, and within the same party, the opportunity sometimes for minority the representation from that party. The Carol Braun and Barbara Curry story is an example of that, but there were certainly times when the people who served in this third slot, or sometimes the second slot, were rather more responsive to the limited political operatives in their own areas than to the minority viewpoint.
So can a distinction be drawn between districts that cumulative voting might have worked better and in other districts where it wouldn't?
I think, generally speaking, if the point of the cumulative vote multi-member district was to do what Joseph Medill wanted it to do, which was to infect the Republicans from the suburbs with an understanding of what the issues in the cities might be, because Republicans joined in the caucus no matter what area they represented. Similarly, the Democrats, I think it did well. The system served that well. In districts, however, that were overwhelmingly one party, where 75–80% of the people would have cast a Republican or a Democratic ballot, in some of those districts, the person who presumably represented the other party was, because that local party was not very well organized, was not very active, was not somebody who was especially chosen by virtue of his or her ability adequately to represent. There were instances of districts in which you had overwhelming partisan majorities, but for whatever reason, the opposition party was able to generate legitimate representation for that third or second party seat. But that was not true across the board.
Would you consider the number of districts where cumulative voting didn't work to be greater than or less than, or
I think that in the larger number of districts it worked. Cumulative voting, multi-member districts worked for the purpose of leavening partisanship, leavening geography with an ability to speak across those partisan and those regional divides. I think the people who represented districts that were Democratic represented them as Republicans, as Susan Catania and Art Telser from the city of Chicago. They were able to cross an important divide between city and suburb because they did an adequate, a very fine job of representing the interests of people who might be Republican, but people who also face the problems of urban dwellers. Eugenia Chapman, representing the Democrats in a Republican district in Arlington Heights, was able to bring a concern about the problems of people on welfare, the need to develop an adequate range of social services. She was able to bring that perspective to her party in Springfield at the same time, she was able to bring to the House Democratic Caucus a concern for fiscal restraint that characterized the people who elected her. So I think there were lots of very good examples of ways in which the individuals representing what made cumulative votes in multi-member districts work did a very effective job. I think there were some people who were less up to that task.
Could we talk a bit about the role of cumulative voting in primaries?
Yes. Well, we talked about a little bit about the role of cumulative voting in the primaries when I talked about Carol Braun and Barbara Curry as a footnote to the political history of the state of Illinois. I think it was helpful to both of us that there was the opportunity for cumulative votes when we were elected, when we were nominated in 1978 in the primary and elected in November. The first time two women from the same political party were sent by the same district to seats in the Illinois House of Representatives. And in fact, cumulative votes, I think, were helpful in party primaries in that occasionally there would be a minority faction within the dominant political party. And of course, the stronger the political party in a district, the more at risk the minority faction within that party is in a winner-take-all system. And the cumulative vote gave opportunities for independent progressive reformers to win Democratic seats from the city of Chicago, a task that might have been made much more difficult had cumulative votes not been available.
What did it do for Republicans?
I think in Republican districts, it may have had the effect of depending on the time, depending on what the dominant tone of the party might have been, it could have, first of all, meant independent voices were more likely to succeed. Just assuming a political power structure within the political party, then people who were not part of that dominant structure, whose voices might be more independent of the party line, it was likely to have that very same effect within Republican primaries. Whether ideologically the people who were helped within the Republican Party by virtue of cumulative votes, whether they were likely to be further right or further left of the Republican center is another question.
What did the regulars get out of cumulative voting?
I'm not sure what they thought they got out of it, except that that was the system in which they grew up, and my sense about the regular apparatus of any institutional structure is that it tends to be pretty good at using for its own purposes whatever is there. So I tend to think of institutional structures being fairly bureaucratized, fairly risk-averse, comfortable with what they have, because it's not as clear that their ability to succeed under a new system will be as effective. I think it's certainly from the perspective of the Democrats in the Illinois House of Representatives during the days of the cumulative vote. I think there certainly were some city districts in which the apparent Republican representative was extremely responsive to the Democratic leadership by virtue of city jobs or by virtue of exactly what I'd said earlier, and that is that in some overwhelmingly Democratic districts, the Democrats were essentially able to control the winner of the Republican Party seat. The same, I'm sure, happened downstate. What that means is that each party has a sense that it has some ability to work with members from the other political party on some important issues.
Is that a good thing?
Well, if the issue is we're talking about control here, I'm not sure control is a good thing under any system. But I'm not sure that that kind of control was worse, was more rampant, was more apparent under the cumulative vote multi-member district system than it is today.
Some argue the leadership has gotten much stronger since
I think the leadership has become much stronger, and again, it's not clear that's entirely a function of the end of cumulative voting. I think it also dovetails with the cut in the number of representatives. It's a lot easier to control 118 people than 177. It is a lot easier to pay attention to what's going on with each individual member when you have 118 than when you have 177. Also, I think tensions between members from the same political party in any given district tended to make the control issue a harder one as well. And that was one of the other, right? We talked a little bit about civility. Was it more civil in those days or was it today? And while the heavy partisanship that characterizes life in the Assembly today was not as apparent in those days, there certainly were tensions between the members from the same district, often tensions that spilled over into election season.
Could you elaborate on that?
Well, there was frequently, one would discover that that the two legislators from District X, the two Democrats or the two Republicans, had spent the entire campaign season trying to outsmart one another rather than working together. And usually that happened in primary contests, not generally in generals, but in politically competitive districts. Obviously the question, if you've got a district that can go either Republican or Democratic, you have a lot of pressure on the winners of the Democratic and the Republican primary on which three are going to be the folks who actually take their seats the second Wednesday in January.
So in your first primary?
So a lot of sneaking around, a lot of gossiping, a lot of chit-chat, and a lot of looking over the shoulder.
Were you tempted to bullet in your first few primaries?
In my first campaign, each of the 10 of us ran separate campaigns. So, and it was not that we were saying only vote for me. We said nice things about Carol in particular, but we were asking for support. In the second campaign, we had I think it was the second campaign. Essentially, Carol and I worked together to some extent, but we also worked separately. So it was one of those things in which we were supportive of one another, but there was no deal signed in blood that said that any time I asked for a vote, I needed to ask for one for her as well, nor vice versa.
Could you talk a bit about what constituent service was like with having two other representatives in your district?
Wow, it does go back a way. I think that it operated pretty much the way it does now. You know, people call you, they get you in, and they talk to you, or they knew one of the representatives, or had some reason by virtue of reading an article in the paper to think that this representative will be responsive. So I think that all kind of worked out. I don't think it's very different from what it is today.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, what about the effect cumulative voting had on the election of women?
Well, that's been the subject of some discussion, and some have argued that it was a help to the election of women. We made that argument when we were fighting the cutback amendment in 1980. We didn't win with that argument, and in fact, actually, after the reapportionment of '82, and again after the reapportionment of '92, women tended to fare better than they had in the past. Now, that's true across the country. Women have done increasingly well, and it's hard to separate out whether, had we retained the cumulative vote, women would have done, in fact, even better. And I just don't know that, I don't know that anyone's done the empirical research to settle the point.
Can we talk a bit about how we lost cumulative voting?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, we lost cumulative voting because Pat Quinn, super populist, made it a major issue. He gathered enough petition signatures to put the issue on the ballot, and while the many argued that the proposition did not meet the constitutional requirement affecting both the structure and the process of the legislature, the Illinois Supreme Court concluded that the petition did meet, or the amendment language did meet that two-pronged test, and so the issue was on the ballot. Well, Pat Quinn basically ran this campaign, the campaign to eliminate cumulative voting, not on the question of the way we elect our representatives. He ran the campaign based on the proposition that you can throw 59 bums out with a single vote, and you can save taxpayer money because you're not supporting this expensive, large system of elected politicians. There were other groups more credible than he, that one might think, for example, the League of Women Voters. The League was very much more concerned about the ease with which the voters understood the system of election. They were not for an end to cumulative voting because they thought it was a good idea to throw 59 rascals out with a single vote, nor because they thought that a smaller legislature was necessarily better, but because they thought that the cumulative vote multi-member district was itself a complex system that made it difficult for people to understand their relationship to their elected representatives. And they also, I believe, were of the view that a single-member system encourages compromise, encourages an attention to majority view within the community, actually better represents and reflects the views of the folks back home.
What's your take on the League's position?
Well, I think that stems from a position that's been in favor of, for example, the short ballot. I mean, that's a traditional League view. And I think that they came to this conclusion because they thought that it was a complicated system. On paper, it is complicated. In my view, most people didn't seem to have a lot of trouble figuring it out. And in fact, of course, we had single-member representation in the Illinois State Senate. If one were concerned about having too many legislators costing far too much, another option would have been to abolish the state Senate, but nobody put in an amendment to do that.
Would you be in favor of such an amendment?
Well, at the time, I certainly would have been. Well, I mean, actually, I would not, no. If one is going to lop off 59 people, that would seem to me to have been as sensible approach as any. I don't know that the value of two chambers is as great when each is elected in the same fashion as when we had a very different structure for representation in the House from what we had in the Senate. If, as a matter of practical politics, I think that there is some value in two chambers, even when elected the same way, the answer is sure, because what happens is each chamber understands that there is a break over there, and if we've gone too far, they can stop it. Similarly, they can play their games knowing that the House will call a halt. But that's partly a function of the culture of knowing that under this structure with two chambers, there's somebody someplace else who might be willing to take the heat. If you didn't have that, you might find that legislators behaved more responsibly in whatever chamber was available to them.
Could you talk about the effects of having two houses, each elected differently?
Well, I don't, you know, it was 4 years that I was in the House when we had the system of cumulative votes and multi-member districts, and I just don't have a handle on whether we were more or less responsible in the sense of passing legislation to the Senate that would have caused serious problems had it gone any further. But I do think that a different structure is a value if you're going to have a bicameral system. That if you're going to have two chambers, there ought to be something different about the election of those chambers in order to justify having both. And I don't think that size alone, particularly in a state where you're talking either 98 or 196,000 people, I don't think that size difference justifies two chambers. As I said, one thing some might argue does justify two chambers is that each can act as a brake on irresponsible actions of the other, but that itself is partly a function of a culture in which clearly there is a brake, and if people do want to behave irresponsibly, they may think that theirs is not the last word. So I thought it was valuable to, in terms of the debate, in terms of the discussion, in terms of coming to solutions to state problems, I thought it was healthy to have a debate that was likely to operate on a different level, on a different scale, brought in different kinds of interests in one chamber, and have another chamber that operated under a different electoral principle.
Could you talk a bit about the effects of cumulative voting in single-member districts on racial representation?
Well, I think we did have, in the days of multi-member districts and cumulative votes, we did have African Americans representing majority white districts and whites coming from districts that were predominantly African American. And I don't know what the numbers would show in terms, I don't know if anybody ever looked at that question as a separate proposition. Truck driver, so.
Yeah. Can you talk a bit about Jesse Jackson?
No.
Okay. All right. Thought I'd ask. Let's see. So if there is to be a revival of cumulative voting, how might that, or could that come about?
I think it'd be very difficult to bring back cumulative voting with multi-member districts. I don't see a cry for it from the public generally. People do understand the current system, and while, as I say, I think the League was overstating the difficulty people had with figuring out the cumulative voting system, certainly on its face, everybody understands single-member districts. And not being familiar with using the cumulative vote multi-member system might look as if it would be too complicated, too difficult, too complex. I don't sense any particular, as I say, hue and cry on the part of the body politic. I don't sense any particular enthusiasm from the perspective of those groups that defended it in 1980 when Pat Quinn succeeded in killing it. So, for example, we had support from organized labor. Well, I doubt that organized labor would want to put that back as a major item on its agenda because they have other items on the agenda, and they are able to work comfortably with the current system, even as they were able to work comfortably with the old system. So I don't see a particular spark that's likely to ignite the public to say, yes, we must do this. Maybe Lonnie Guinier will turn out to be the spark. You know, that's been interesting to talk about multi-member districts as a way of increasing representation from minority groups, and suddenly people are talking about it again. But I don't have the impression that that's caught fire.
Do you think among people involved in Illinois politics there's more support for cumulative voting than among the general public?
I think there was, certainly when we had that system, and the people that you've been talking to who were in the legislature, in the House, when we had cumulative voting, my guess is that they're telling you it worked pretty well. I think it did work well, and I think they think so too. I don't think the general public paid enough attention to think hard about the question whether it worked better or less well than the system we have today. So interested publics, by which I mean legislators, lobby groups, those who paid close attention to the business in Springfield, I think by and large thought the cumulative vote multi-member district system was a good one. But I don't know that any of them wants to spend a lot of energy trying to bring it back.
Mm-hmm.
And bar some enthusiastic new spearhead or way of igniting a firestorm, it seems to me hard to capture the public attention for a debate on something so inside baseball as the structure of the way we elect legislators.
Do you think there's any chance for the General Assembly to put a referendum on the ballot?
I don't think so, just because, again, I think that a decreasing number of people who serve today served in the days when we had the cumulative vote in the multi-member districts, and we all know that politicians who are able to survive in a system are risk-averse to trying a new one. So if people win in today's single-member districts, even those who served in the old time, they may be less willing to bring it back than they were to support it in the first place. And certainly those people who were never part of it, who are doing quite nicely, thank you, in today's structure, it would seem to me difficult to convince them that there might be a better way.
One last question. One unresolved question among folks that are interested in cumulative voting would be whether or not it would be politically feasible to go back to the big house, or whether of 177, or whether a proposal would have to feel constrained to keep the existing number of representatives but have larger districts.
Right, so we're back to the question, to what extent were the changes that resulted a function in change in size or a change in structure? I think the political reality is that it would be extremely unlikely that the electorate would decide to expand the number of legislators. So I think if one were to try to revive cumulative voting, I think one would likely be constrained by the existing number of representative seats in the House, and that number is 118. What impact multi-member districts cumulative votes would have if 118 is the number, that's a whole other subject for study and for thought. But I think it would be very difficult to sell to the public, in the face of any opposition at all, sell to the public the notion that they ought to be paying another 59 salaries that they're not responsible for paying today. So unless there was no opposition, unless this became godmotherhood apple pie, had the strong support of all the political parties and Pat Quinn, I don't think it's likely that a proposal that expanded the size of the legislature would fare very well.
The most damning statement I've ever heard about that proposal. This is our chance then to let you say anything that I've neglected to ask you, and if that's nothing, that's fine too.
Okay, well, I must say it was a lot of fun in the days when we had that 177-member House, and we had, really interesting people with really interesting ideas, and the ability to work across partisan lines was a lot greater than it is today. Not that we don't do a lot of work across partisan lines, depending on the issue and depending on the individuals. So I've worked very closely with some of my Republican colleagues, as closely as I worked with some of my Republican colleagues under the old system. But the strictures from a leadership perspective in terms of what issues are sort of eligible for cooperative bipartisan approaches is somewhat different from what it was in the period that I served, 1979 through 1981. And the people that I served with are wonderful. I would not trade them in for anything. I do think there was a certain I don't want to say wackiness, that puts it in the wrong context, but there was a certain flair, a certain verve, a certain willingness to test limits among some of the members of the House in the cumulative voting days that I don't think we see quite so much of today.
I'm sorry to make myself a liar, but do you have an anecdote or an example?
Oh dear, no.
Okay.
No.
Fair enough.
Right, well, exactly.